I was talking with a mentor of mine in the hospital where I was serving as a chaplain. I was a few years away from ordination. Part of my training to be a minister was to not only serve in this hospital, but to share some intentional reflection time with peers and mentors about the things that we were encountering there and the life journeys that had brought us to that point. During this particular reflection time, more than a decade after my mother had died, actually she had committed suicide at the age of 48, I was thinking back to the year or so immediately following her death. I spoke to my mentor of how at that time in my grief, I felt as though I were the star of a movie and that I yearned for everyone else in the world at that time to be supporting players in the drama that I was living. I felt as though everything was or should be about me then. I spoke of how her death had become an essential storyline of my life, how if you wanted to know me at that time, you needed to know about my mom. I confessed to my mentor that now that many years had passed and I'd lived some more life, seen the world from a broader perspective than a grief-stricken 21-year-old could, I had become ashamed at how much attention my heart had craved then, how much I needed my story, to be elevated above others, above the mundane. I was ashamed at how much I needed my grief to be special, how much I needed to be the star. My mentor, he was a wise Quaker man. He let my words hang in the air a bit, and then he offered into the silence a compassionate question that cleared away my shame, a question that I have kept with me ever since. Mark, he said, don't you think we all need to be the star sometimes? Don't you think we all need to be the star sometimes? In the years that have followed that conversation, I've tried in my way to see more often the unspoken need that others have to be the star, to have their reality elevated. I have tried my best to be a supporting player in the movie that they may be living. I've learned enough about grief over the years to understand that it shifts things for those in its grip, how it creates a new reality. And I've also learned that to be willing to enter that shifted reality with the grieving on their terms is not only the most helpful thing I could do, it's actually a privilege unlike nearly any other, a human privilege, to walk with others in their grief and their challenges, not trying to control or to change them, but to simply companion with them, asking them honest questions about how life looks in their shoes, being present in body and spirit the best I can when they answer. Well, it's become a spiritual practice. It's a hopeful, life-affirming, life-enriching practice. It's like staring up at a night sky of our humanity, we might say, and seeing a star among billions of other stars, knowing that its light is also a part of my light and the light of everyone else. In thinking this month about what it means to live a life of kinship, I've found that at the core of nearly every answer I can muster is a need for us to develop our ability to see each other's starlight, we could say. A need for empathy. So this month I've spoken about how to forgive someone. We need to have empathy for that person's reality as well as for our own. Because without that empathy, we may be stuck in the past, unable to move on, unable to give ourselves to a future yet to be created. And last week, we considered how to be a neighbor. We need some empathy too. We need to love our neighbors as ourselves, difficult though that can be. We need to see and know each other's stories enough so that we begin to know these stories as intertwined with our own and worthy of becoming, in more ways, our own stories. And today I'm thinking about how, in order to nurture the kinship that might lead to some more harmony on this planet, this relatively tiny ball of life in an expanding and unfathomably enormous universe that's filled with billions of galaxies, we need some empathy too. We need to see that we are all a product of the same cosmic stew, that we are truly connected with everything else made of the same star stuff. Every one of us. The very same star stuff that on clear nights, away from the oppressive glow of our busy and grief-stricken and distracted lives, we can see adorning the heavens. And we need to know that when we look at our earthbound lives, we are, in fact, looking at the same stars, just in a different form. We need to know that we can turn to one another and finally see the stars everywhere. Living a life of kinship, it seems to me, requires that we try our best to live a life of empathy, a life of seeing, despite all the reasons not to, that we are connected at an organic and an atomic level with everything else. A life of seeing that there are responsibilities that accompany these connections. Responsibilities that are actually privileges that we share in exchange for the precious opportunity of being alive. The quality of our lives together, I've been thinking, depends upon the responsibilities of empathy we accept. The quality of our lives together depends upon the responsibilities of empathy we can accept. I've seen a story making the rounds about the way a tribe in Africa supposedly accepts its responsibilities of empathy. Maybe you've seen it. The story is that when someone in the tribe does something hurtful or wrong, that person is taken to the center of town and the entire tribe comes and surrounds him. For 2 days, they'll tell that man every good thing he has ever done. The tribe believes that every human being comes into the world as good, each of us desiring safety and love, peace and happiness. But sometimes in the pursuit of these things, people make mistakes. The community sees their misdeeds as a cry for help, sees their misdeeds as a cry for help. And so they band together for the sake of their fellow tribe member to hold that person up, to reconnect him to his true nature, to remind him who he really is, until he fully remembers the truth from which he'd temporarily been disconnected. The truth that says, I am good. Stories like these are like red meat for skeptics hungry for their next meal of feel-good nonsense, right? Perhaps some of you are licking your chops. You're not alone. A search for this story on the internet will bring countless posts of derisive dismissal. Don't waste our time with this garbage, the posts scream. Life is pain. No amount of touchy-feely love your neighbors despite what they do fairy tales will change that. Period. End of story. And truth be told, this story is probably a modern-day folktale at best. And yet, what about the truth that it carries? What about the possibility it suggests? When you heard it, did you perhaps yearn for a tribe that might do that for you? Can you imagine being encircled with love and affirmation even when you have screwed up or are traveling a destructive course? Can you imagine what it might be like to live in a world where we are truly connected, where wrongdoing is taken seriously, and yet empathy and possibility for redemption remains at the heart of everything? A colleague of mine recently preached a sermon in which he shared that story of the African tribe and suggested we could know it was true after what happened between Antoinette Tuff and Michael Brandon Hill a few weeks back. You remember that story, don't you? Antoinette was working in the office of an elementary school in Decatur, Georgia, when Michael forcibly entered, heavily armed, with the apparent intent to murder as many as he could. In the face of this likely violence, most of us might have hid or run, but Antoinette took a different approach. She surrounded Michael with compassion. She let her light shine, reminding him of his own. She talked him through the next several tension-filled minutes, finding connections between them, affirming his goodness, sharing some of her own story of loss and pain, and reminding him, honey, we all go through something in life. We all go through something in life. The story, we know, concludes with him surrendering and countless lives being saved. But if we were to turn this story into a Facebook post with some of the details missing, but the core of the story remaining, it too might be a scoff-worthy tale. Life is pain, no amount of touchy-feely love your neighbors despite what they do. Fairy tales will change that. Period. End of story. After all, this past week, another disaffected and mentally disturbed man, probably not all that unlike Michael Brandon Hill, entered the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., intent on murder. No one was able to talk him down, to surround him with goodness. More than a dozen people, innocent people, died. And therein lies all the proof that we need that stories of empathy do not always triumph. In our experience, overly saturated with stories of random and shocking violence, stories of empathy overcoming violence are the exception rather than the rule, right? Even if stories like Antoinette's are the exception, that doesn't mean they aren't true or that we can't learn from them. My wife is currently serving as a student teacher at a nearby elementary school during this hectic time for her as she wearies herself with hoop jumping and navigating on-the-job training, some would call indentured servitude, that every student teacher must endure. My role as her husband and her friend is to, when we find quiet moments at the end of our busy days, to listen to her retell the stories of all the young lives she has encountered that day, the good stories, the not-so-good stories. In particular, the stories of how some of these young people, through actions of their own, sometimes actions of their families, sometimes even actions of well-meaning but overburdened and understandably caustic school staff, these young people are sometimes separated from community at the very moment when they need community the most. Stories of how, when a wrong has been committed in the classroom, empathy for what prompted the wrong is sometimes exchanged for anger. The possibility of redemption is traded for retribution, and the starlight that could be shared becomes obliterated by floodlights of fear and fatigue. These stories are common for us in schools or not in schools, right? And when we talk about these stories, neither Susan nor I have anything but compassion for the teachers struggling with how to deal with challenging kids. We can see these teachers' starlight, knowing it as our own. But when I hear these stories, removed as I am from the angst of the classroom, not having to navigate the bad behaviors myself, I also find some grace. I find that I have the space and the inclination to imagine the light of these young people too, the light that they may not yet have the capacity to share, at least not without love and support of their family and their community, love and support that we can imagine may be in short supply. Now, these young people need to be held accountable, yes, but they also need kinship, right? They need examples of another way to be. They need to be encircled with reminders of their goodness. They need the same things every one of us needs: to be loved, to be connected, to be relevant, to be participants in the goings-on of activities and events around us. We spend so much of our lives in isolation from and denial of the truth that we already are connected with each other, with the universe that is not just around us, but that is in us? Starting from that place of connection that we share, might we begin to understand our responsibility to each other anew? Might we begin to translate the yearning we have to be loved into a discipline of loving others? Might we be as generous with our empathy as we may have been with our judgment? What would it be like for more people more of the time if we did? Hafiz wrote, "Think about this great pull in us to connect. Why not become the one who lives with a full moon in each eye that is always saying with that sweet moon language what every other eye in this world is dying to hear? You are loved. We are more alike than different. You have the stuff of stars within you." In the days to come, may each of us find revealed in the star show that is our lives together this light that we share, and may we shine that light so others may do the same. For don't you think we all need to be the star sometimes? Don't you think we all need to be the star?